Good evening, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Self-Care Sunday. I'm joined again by our amazing panel of African-American men of all ages and different backgrounds, and we will be sharing our perspectives on police reform today. We're also joined by Lieutenant Charles. He will also be here to share some perspective with us and some insight. I've been doing some research and I've kind of come across the fact that us being genetically disenfranchised is something that begins from a really, really early age. They're saying right now that school-age kids from the age of 2 all the way up through high school are already going through corporal punishment, and mostly those numbers are favoring in our African-American students the most. They're being viewed as older than they really are and not being treated fairly. And I feel like that has a lot of psychological effects on those that are perceiving this and those that are receiving it. And pretty much they're on the fast track to prison based on that knowledge. They're being treated this way when they're babies and children already. So that's just something for you guys to keep in mind, that this situation that we're going on with is starting in school, from daycare, from the minute that they're put out of your home into society. So let's start off with police reform. I know that there's a lot been going on since the movement of Black Lives Matter, that this is really what triggered that movement, that really started that movement and gave it fire, is just, us being treated, I would say, less than we should be. Our civil rights are being extremely challenged, and we really want equal opportunity, equal treatment, and fairness across the board. So that's really what started this whole entire movement. And just as us being activists in our own ways and in our own lives, I'd like to share some perspective and shed some insight on that. So I'm going to start off with Michael. Right now we're discussing police reform, and I know that there's a lot of changes that's happening, but I really want to know what we feel like that should look like on specific aspects, not just a wide range of things, but specifically, let's talk about mental health. If we want police reform to take place on a mental health level, what do you think that should really look like?
On a mental health level, there are certain training that I think police officers should should be subjected to. It brings to mind the lady I was trying to remember last time we spoke was Dr. Joy DeGruy. She works in the Washington, in the Seattle area, and she does work in the area of training police officers about cultural differences in communities. As far as mental health, I think it's from an outsider. I think being a police officer in certain areas can be very stressful, period. And from where I stand, sometimes a police officer looks like a hammer. So therefore, if you send them out for, let's say, a disturbance in the neighborhood, then the problem looks like a nail. And then we have what we have just kept repeating. I think the resources of the police should be used differently. In other words, when you call 911, and depends on what the call is about, some of those calls does not need a police officer to respond to. So when allocating resources, some of it is already there. All we have to do is streamline it, where when the call comes in, it goes to the proper place. Because we've seen over and over where police officer can disarm a disturbed person with a knife or a gun without shooting them. Yet in the African-American community, it's quite the opposite. If a man is disturbed and wielding a gun in his hand, it's normal for him to be shot, and then it's justified that he was attacking the police officer. So I'm simply saying, we don't know what's in the mind of some police officers, especially if they come from different communities. And I think police officers should be subjected to, there are tests that exist, evaluation rather, that exists, where police officers should be able to sit and take a written exam to understand what their thinking is when working in stressful environment, because there are officers that I think that should not be allowed with a gun, honestly. So the evaluation process, yes, I'm in favor of that, and it should be done across the board in a way that is comprehensive, and then the results, most importantly, should be taken very seriously. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Michael. Durrell, I would like you to respond more on the aspect of biases. I know that biases really lead everyone in their direction, especially when it comes to the way that they think and they perceive things. So can you answer that question based on just biases in general, Durrell, on how you think changes can be made on the mental health aspects?
Well, as Michael said, good evening, everybody, first and foremost. Thanks for having me on. From a mental aspect in terms of bias, well, if you look at bias itself, that is a lot. There's a lot of that going on in the community because there's a lot of preconceived notions based on the neighborhood or part of geography where you live. So unfortunately, yeah, we can be a product of a situation like this, where based on a particular neighborhood, police officers may have a certain bias towards it, and that goes back to getting to understand your community more. But the biggest component that I really want to talk about is mental health. Is the problem within our communities. If you think about mental health, I looked up a study that said 2,700 programs exist right now for crisis intervention across the United States. And it's an average of 175,000 NYPD calls regarding emotionally disturbed persons. So that lets me know right there that a lot of our communities need help in different aspects in terms of mental health. So the police itself already has a lot to deal with. You know, they're dealing with, in New York City, NYPD is dealing with terrorist type situations. You know, they're dealing with all sorts of crisis, you know, and it makes it hard for them to focus more on a situation where they're not properly trained for. They do have programs that exist called the CIT program, in which I looked over, where, you know, there's certified personnel within the NYPD. But I think the bigger picture is a broader program, like a unit. I think it should be a specific unit that deals with emotionally disturbed persons, which has something to do with mental health. I'll leave you with this last fact. The Journal of American Academy of Psychiatry and the Law reported that 1,000 people were shot by the police in 2018 had mental illness. So that lets you know right there that, you know, we do need to, you know, have better programs and on the onset for training for the police, but not to mention just a specific unit to deal with these type of calls. The Florida model has an emergency psychiatric line in which you can call in, and when you call in, you let them know what your emergency is. They either put it to I think it was Landley who talked about this last time we had the conversation, where they have two lines where it's 911, the emergency, and the other one's the psychiatric hotline. New York State needs this, and I think if we have this, it'll be better results for the police and the community itself, dealing with mental health and perceived biases that exist within the community. So we need a separate unit that would handle this. I think that's what we should invest in next.
Thank you, Durrell. Lieutenant Charles, do you mind adding anything to this? What do you think is happening? Or is there any changes that's going to be taking place in regards to police reform in the mental health aspects of things?
So, absolutely, and I want to just say again, thank you guys for having me on here with you. You've all touched upon really, really great points, and I'm going to try to, my ideas are kind of swimming around in my head right now, but I'm going to try to corral those and put those the best that I can into words. Just in terms of mental health, and going back to what Mr. Dawkins said earlier, with mental health and a written exam for the training. So I can tell you that we do go through extensive training in terms of mental health and how to approach those situations. And that starts right from within the police academy, okay? I went to Westchester County Police Academy, NYPD Academy, LAPD, they all have similar trainings that deal with the issue of encountering a person who is in mental distress or going through a crisis. Those trainings are helpful. We do try to have those trainings in service. The training is called in service. We try to do that at least once a year, where we revisit things that we've learned. We see laws as they've changed, and we see new resources as they come out, in which we can provide those resources and assistance for people in need of such. In terms of an exam, no, there's, as far as I know, within my department, there is no exam that anybody takes to reevaluate our mental state as law enforcement officers, but I like to think that those things are kind of monitored. It's the job of the supervisors to actually monitor those types of things. And, you know, we're all humans. You know, I put on this uniform, I'm a police officer, but I'm only a police officer 1/3 of my day. The other 2/3, I'm just another black man on the street. All right. So with that being said, you know, to reevaluate your officers and consider and think about the struggles that they might be going through outside of the department is something to take into consideration, and that might need to be looked into a little bit further, because you have, you know, divorces, you have struggling to pay bills, so on and so forth. And I'm not trying to make any excuses by no means, but what I'm touching upon is that we need to evaluate our personnel more to determine when somebody's coming to a breaking point, and get those resources that we're giving to the community to our officers as well, to try to get them back in line with what the community needs in order to serve it correctly. And then I'll jump real quickly and then let Omar come in terms of a demographic. So I work in an area where I work for the New York State University Police at Purchase College, and being at a college and in a college setting, according to statistics, most people have their first psychotic break in the very age group that I work with. So usually around 15 to 24, sometimes the number is a little bit higher, but around 15 to 24 is when people have their first psychotic episode where they're in a crisis and they need some sort of assistance. And my department has streamlined getting them that assistance without necessarily having a uniformed personnel be present. Because, I mean, let's face it, no matter what color you are, but especially for the Black community, seeing that this uniform puts you in a heightened sense. And if anybody says that they're not in a heightened sense, they gotta be lying, because I tell you, when I take my uniform off and I'm driving home and the lights go on behind me, get a little jitters, get a little shakes. And I've been on the job for 12 years. So adding that aspect to it does not help. And what we've done is we've set up a system where 911 is called. Yes, we do receive that phone call. We create a report for it, but we reach out to a psychologist psychiatrist directly, in order to get them the help that they need. And we connect those two numbers and those two people together, where our presence is never felt necessarily in the physical form, but we still do our jobs in providing that that crisis assistance that's needed right then and there, without heightening that person to a level that's going to incite them to make us have to do our job in terms of gaining compliance and gaining control. We never even get to that point. The person gets the help that they need, and you know, it's something that's been working for us. And I think if other departments implemented it and kind of looked into it, at least started some research into it, you know, we would have a lot less incidents of officers feeling the need to use deadly force to stop what they perceive to be a threat. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing that. We appreciate you coming on. That was a different perspective. Thank you for that. So Omar, I would like to ask you next. Let's move into the aspect of reallocating funds, right? So there's this large conversation taking place right now about how we plan to reallocate funds, redistribute funds. I'm hearing that there's office.
A little jitters, get a little shakes. And I've been on the job for 12 years. So adding that aspect to it does not help. And what we've done is we've set up a system where 911 is called. Yes, we do receive that phone call. We create a report for it, but we reach out to a psychologist psychiatrist directly, in order to get them the help that they need. And we connect those two numbers and those two people together, where our presence is never felt necessarily in the physical form, but we still do our jobs in providing that that crisis assistance that's needed right then and there, without heightening that person to a level that's going to incite them to make us have to do our job in terms of gaining compliance and gaining control. We never even get to that point. The person gets the help that they need. And you know, it's something that's been working for us. And I think if other departments implemented it and kind of looked into it, at least started some research into it, you know, we would have a lot less incidents of officers feeling the need to use deadly force to stop what they perceive to be a threat. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing that. We appreciate you coming on. That was a different perspective. Thank you for that. So Omar, I would like to ask you next. Let's move into the aspect of reallocating funds, right? So there's this large conversation taking place right now about how we plan to reallocate funds, redistribute funds. That I'm hearing that there's officers pretty much quitting the force because they're not happy with this decision. And in your mind, in your perspective, how do you think those funds should really be reallocated specifically that would benefit our community?
I had the privilege of, well, like we've been discussing this like passively for some time, but like I've been working in the Brooklyn community, and now I'm coming back to the Bronx, and to be more hands-on and know what's going on in the community, having an idea of what's needed. But I say all that to say this: every community is the same. I think we need to, before I touch on as far as where should the funds be allocated, I just think before we even talk about the funding, understand what that means. It's not taken necessarily away from majority of the funds of police officers. There are some, I'm reading reports that, like you said, they're quitting the force because of such disadvantage. But it's not merely disadvantage, it's just a matter of, okay, we're no longer going to allocate X amount of dollars to this until we see this, right? So if you compartmentalize that, for example, I'm a teacher, and if I don't maintain such, performance as a teacher, I'm at risk of losing my job, right? And I think police officers at times are not held as accountable, and that kind of, shifts the belief system a bit. So as far as answering the question, as far as allocation, I just think mental health throughout the community, and that includes police officers, right? I think most of them are walking around with certain types of trauma. I was watching this documentary, and this one police officer quit the force because of a traumatic experience he had with a civilian. And it was so traumatic, it just changed the trajectory. And then he also realized that his own police department was the problem. So I would say not enough money and not enough attention goes into mental health, and not enough goes into education, but I'm just biased. But I also feel that for the most part, we tend to take a blind eye to what the ramifications of mental health.
Devon, what about you? What do you think we should do with this reallocation of funds in the police reform?
Hey, family, greetings. Nice to be here again. Spoke about programs, and I was thinking that maybe, we could fund some kind of, educational program that, let each understand each other, so to speak. For example, I think a lot of cops that police the neighborhoods have no clue what's going on around them, or does not understand the people they're policing. And I think that's one of the issue. And I think, we should, set up something where we sit and talk to each other. For example, the community, I think the community should, and the police should, have meetings. We should talk. We should understand what's going on. We should understand who is policing us.
Thank you. You're absolutely correct. I believe Langley was here last time saying that he feels like the officers should live in the communities in which they serve and know each other by name. So when you see John coming down the street doing something, you know that it's John, and you're going to call his mother instead of throwing him into jail. So thank you for that.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Would anyone else like to add anything to that?
I just want to say that that $11 billion is allocated to NYPD for fiscal year 2020, right? So that's 80% of that money goes to salaries and wages, right? So when you think about that, when we say we want to reform the police, or they say defund, I don't like to use the word defund because it makes it seem like we're trying to take away the police. We're not. If we reallocate the funds, some of the funds, let it be contingent on police accountability. I mean, I work for the bank right now. My performance is based on what I do in certain buckets that I hit in terms of performance. If I don't get X, and if I'm not following compliance, and if I got red flags over the place, they take money away from me. So this is not uncommon. This is something that can happen. and should happen. I mean, in this particular situation, there's way too many deaths. It's too many situations where, you know, there's disproportionately blacks are being killed on the police watch. So in that situation, in this particular performance metric, we need to pull some funds back. And if the departments change, we can actually, the mayor or whoever city council can reallocate funds appropriately based on performance. So it's like a catch-22, you know. Omar mentioned last time they pull money from the police, from education all the time, you know, in terms of the school system, you know. So this is not something that is so uncommon. It's just that's something we should look at and reallocate the funds for a better cause. In this situation, we realize in America, like I said, mental health is the biggest problems we have in the country, and in particular New York.
Listen, if the kids are not the main focus at this juncture, then I'm not sure what the purpose is. Just got word that somebody from in the Bronx, not too far from where I grew up, in Bronxdale, they were brutally beaten and robbed. And if you're not familiar with that area, there's like a headquarters, like a station. I'm not really sure what they call it, but they have like this beaming light, and they have like this, it's like a station. Like you can only go up there if you like climb up there, and they like kind of like surveillance the hood, and that was still able to happen. So I get frustrated when things like that occur and nothing happens afterward. Just got word that somebody from in the Bronx, not too far from where I grew up, in Bronxdale, they were brutally beaten and robbed. And if you're not familiar with that area, there's like a headquarters, like a station. I'm not really sure what they call it, but they have like this beaming light, and they have like this, it's like a station. Like you can only go up there if you like climb up there, and they like kind of like surveillance the hood, and that was still able to happen. So I get frustrated when things like that occur and nothing happens afterward.
Lieutenant Charles, would you like to add anything to that on what police reform you think should look like, where those funds should be allocated?
Absolutely. So in terms of the funding, personally, I think defunding the police is not necessarily the worst idea that's put out there. Okay, to take that money and put it into a program in which the likelihood of a person encountering a cop based on the opportunities that they have been given through those funds, I think that goes a long way. Programs that are in place that keep you know, the youth occupied, educated, off the streets, things like that provide a different pathway, and ultimately will stop their encountering, and not necessarily stop, but maybe deterrence, and for some, yes, absolutely stop their encounters that they may have with law enforcement in general. There's this idea in policing called community policing, and it's great on paper. It's tougher to put into practice when the funding for those types of things, because to say I care about you is one thing, and to throw an event and hand out pamphlets and all that other stuff, you know, that's all fine and well. But the interactions and the effort in community building that goes behind it, the time behind it, the projects behind it, that money has to come from somewhere. And I think using the money that is taken from the department should be put into more community oriented events. I think another thing would, not necessarily in relation to the money, but again, with the programs coming from that money, I think a little bit of patience can go a long way as well. People finding the time to actually have these events. And I'm also gonna go on a limb and say to put programs in place where the police aren't necessarily involved, where you don't have a uniformed personnel in the area, just really community building things that focuses strictly on the needs of the community without necessarily hearing from a cop. Like, I almost wish I could have done this interview out of my uniform, because right now I'm talking to you guys as a police officer and as a black man. I kind of wanted to just come to you as a black man with police experience, if that makes any sense. So again, that's pretty much my thoughts on defunding the police. And for those officers, as Omar said, I believe it was Omar that said, officers walking off the job because of defunding the police and things like that. That's not taking money out of the officers' pockets. so to speak. They still get their salaries, they still get their pensions and things like that. That's taking money away from technology and sources used, other resources used to combat crime. But again, that's why we're here to begin with. At least that's why you posed that question to begin with, because the way that it's been used in combating crime nowadays have resulted in too many lost lives of African Americans on the streets. And obviously that way is not working. We got to try something different.
Here's some practical ideas we can do. We have known for a long time that schools, public schools as they are, they're failing miserable. That is no secret. Studies after studies have been done. We know the reason why schools are failing. Certain key elements are taken out of school. We also know that young people, when they have nothing to do within certain hours, are prone to get in trouble with law. So here's what we do. Put back the needed programs back in school that was not there. That's one. Number two, I don't know the last time you've been into a school, it looks more like a barracks with all the security stuff, and then with a uniformed police there. Those kids coming from a home that is already stressed and coming into this thing where you have to go through this metal detector and whatever, now they're double stressed. And then when a kid act up in class because of maybe issues that's going on at home, the response is to call a uniformed police officer. Now that child is escalated to a level, and now you have a 12-year-old being handcuffed by a police officer, a situation way overblown. Stop making schools look like detention centers. Okay, use some of that money for that. Number two, put counselors back in school. And when I say school, I mean inner city school, because these resources does exist in school in other areas. I know because I've been in them. Okay, you go into predominantly white areas, it looks like a school, but you go into the inner city school, it looks like a detention center. Okay, the color, everything. Put counselors back in. There are people out there who can reach children when they're having problems that are below the surface. And these children will not be able to perform in school. They will become what teachers call the disruptive element in class. We know all of that. Use those funds to do that. Number three, the final one I'll make is take high-level police officers, go into school and sit down and have a talk with children, like teens who are likely to run. Have an exchange. Let the police officer explain to the auditorium of young people what it is, why police get involved with certain things, what make things go out of hand. Then the police listen to the young people talking about, well, I was just having fun with one of my friends and the police officer thought I did this. That simple exchange can bring a level of awareness and understanding when high-level police officer, and the reason why I say that, because we're talking about policymakers. I think all of us are aware that there's an internal culture in the police department, and the lieutenant can get into more specific if you ask for that. Bring high-level police officers into inner city schools and have a talk, have an exchange, so kids understand the police officer, and then by then we can bring the respect factor back in. And that to me will put us on a level where we know can start. Police and community are now communicating. Thank you.
What Mike is saying, essentially, you're basically saying rebranding the police. Because at the end of the day, after reform is happening. By 2021, reform will be on a national level at some point. And pretty much we have to rebrand the police. And to me, that rebranding has to do a lot with community. So it will definitely be some type of initiative where it is some type of coalition that, there's community and police. And that will look like, like we're talking about barbecues like they used to do back in the day, basketball tournaments. It could be anything, a whole host of things to put police back in a better light where they're actually working with the community instead of it looking like they're working against or fighting the community.
I just had a clarifying question for Michael. You mentioned high functioning, you said? Officers, can you explain that further? Like, what do you mean by that, high functioning?
What I meant, Omar, was high-level police officers. police officers who make policies, um,
Okay.
all those higher up ones, because after you being in an office for a while, you can somewhat become detached from what's really happening on the street. The police
Mhm.
who walk the beat has a different experience. And what Durrell said would be great, where if I know the name of the police officer coming up to me, I think that changes the dynamics right away. So not just the street level police officer, but I think the ones who set policies, even the
I,
even the commissioner should at times participate in these gatherings, whether it be community or a group of inner schools, and that exchange between high level police officers who set policies, and that interaction with the community. Because hey guys, without the community there is no police. The two need each other to work. So why not put them together and let us talk directly together? So when policies are being set, the higher levels come away with a different perspective of the community. That's where I was getting to, Omar.
no, it's all good. I was just mainly asking because I was just pushing maybe instead of considering high level or those type of officers, I'm just thinking those officers who are or within the community. So there's a precinct that's not too far from where I am, and I'm pretty sure schools, neighboring schools, might be trying to get in contact with them to try to start that dialogue with any type of officer. I think would suffice for this because you are right. Conversation needs to be had because there's a level of uncertainty and not feeling comfortable with police officers. And think of that from the eyes of say a third grader who's watching these things occur on the news and not really being able to put things together. They have an idea in their head of what police officers are, and that image may not be may not be good for them to continue on without having that conversation. So I think thinking about the ones who are a bit more tender to this is definitely just as important. I think the conversation needs to continue to happen because there is a level of trauma. There's 8 minutes and 46 seconds of an officer with his knee on someone's neck. Think of that from the eyes of a young child who doesn't really understand that. And I think, as you said, the counselors need to be involved, and also police officers within the community need to have that steadily communication open for students, especially of those who are not able to process this the right way. So I mean, that's my main concern.
Omar, you brought up a great point on that. Young kids trying to perceive the world around them, considering what's safe and what's not safe. The schools looking like a detention center, them walking in and being treated already as a suspect just going through the door. So I think that really does play a part, and we need to do better as a community to really change those things.